Hopefully, since you stumbled across this podcast, you understand that I might be talking about topics that are a little bit sensitive for some people and can be a little bit triggering at times for other people. So, if you are one of those people that have a tendency to feel that way, please keep that in mind while listening to this podcast. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Sinister Story Hour with Steph. This is the podcast where we combine story time with true crime. So if you're ready for that, stay tuned. Tonight we're talking about the Black Dahlia, and as you know, this one is a rough case. So if you are sensitive at all, this is probably not the episode for you. Maybe check out a different episode of mine. This one's going to be pretty rough. So we will get into it, and we hope you enjoy it. Our story starts with Elizabeth Short, who goes by Betty. Betty was born on July 29th, 1924, so we actually share a birth date. She is born in Boston. She spends most of her life in Medford, Massachusetts, and she had some breathing issues, so she did spend time in Florida because it had a lower elevation, and she found it a little bit easier to breathe. So she eventually goes to California where her father lived, and a lot of people say that she was an aspiring actress, but there's never any real proof of that she made any attempt at acting. She never had any actual roles or auditions or anything that would support that. So like I said, she goes to California to live with her dad. She ends up staying there for a pretty short time because they don't really get along by most reports. So she ends up staying with her friend Dorothy French, and that seemed like about a month long that she ends up staying with her friend Dorothy. So one night on January 8th, a man named Robert, they call him Red Manley, picks her up from Dorothy's. The next day, on January 9th, he drops her off at the Biltmore Hotel in LA, and that's actually the last time that she's seen alive. Okay, so let's get into the crime scene. So on the morning of January 15th, 1947, a mother is taking her 2-year-old child for a walk in an LA neighborhood, and she sees something that she thinks might be a mannequin. So when she takes a closer look, she quickly realizes that it's not a mannequin. It's actually one of the most horrendous crimes ever to be discovered. So luckily, they're able to identify the body, and she is soon dubbed the Black Dahlia. There are conflicting stories on how the name the Black Dahlia comes to be. The Blue Dahlia was a movie that was very, very popular during that time, and most likely that's the reason that it came about. But there are some reports of that possibly being her nickname even before she was killed. So it is identified as Elizabeth Short or Betty. Okay, so the body of Betty is only a few feet from the sidewalk, and it's in a vacant lot, and it's posed in a very bizarre way. When you think of the Black Dahlia, what you know, that's probably what you know, is that it was posed in a pretty bizarre way, but there were a lot of different details about this that I had no idea of, so hopefully people will learn something new with us. So the one thing that stands out to investigators immediately is that nothing in this scene is a coincidence. Everything is very, very carefully planned and meticulously placed. So the fact that somebody would have time to do that and be so meticulous about the planning and everything, placing the body at the scene, really stood out to me. That kind of crazy. They do find some large cement bags and fertilizer bags at the scene, and they're determined that they were probably used to transport the body and the body parts of Elizabeth Short to the scene. The bags are found with watery blood in them. So keep that in mind, because that's going to be kind of useful later on, I guess. So as far as the murder, this is the part that gets pretty gruesome. Okay, are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so every single part of the body has been scrubbed clean. There's no blood found anywhere. So when we talked about the Cleveland torso murders, we talked about the same thing, right?
Yep.
Very similar. But there are a lot of differences that I found out while I was researching this. That was about the one of the few similarities, I guess.
Mm.
So her right breast is removed. She has scalpel lacerations to her upper lip, 8 cigarette burns on her back. She had been sodomized with an unknown object. There was a removal of a large section of flesh from her thigh. I think they said about 4 inches of a square of her thigh was removed, and it was then inserted into her vagina. She had a scalpel laceration that was about 2 inches long on her left nipple. There was a tic-tac-toe cross-cut shape that was cut into her right hip, and they determined that to be with a scalpel. There were ligature marks on her feet, hands, and neck, also determined to be from a scalpel. Blunt force trauma to her face and her head. There were incisions on her pelvic area that was similar to that of a hysterectomy. So basically, they had given her what the same scars as what a hysterectomy would show. Her mouth was also slashed almost from ear to ear in almost like what we would know now as the Joker face, but kind of a permanent smile, almost ear to ear. Her stomach was filled with unknown green granules and feces. So the only way that could happen for her stomach to be containing those items is that she was forced at some point to consume feces prior to her death. There's also, as we probably all know, anybody who knows this case knows that her body was cut in half. So not only was it cut in half, it was a surgical bisection of her body, and that is an actual surgical procedure. Okay, so in order to actually cut the body in half without cutting through any bone, there is an actual term for that. They learn it in surgical school, and so it was most likely they determined somebody who knows what they're doing as far as medically trained, a medically trained surgeon, and has done this sort of thing or learned it in surgical school. So, what do you think?
That's very, very dark and brutal and
horrifying. Yeah. Poor woman, and her poor family members that actually on Bailey Sarian talks about this on one of her Murder Mystery Makeup Mondays, and I'd never found anything to back this up, but she was talking about how they originally went to talk to the father, and the father came to the door drunk and said he didn't give a shit, basically. And so he closed the door and did not answer the door anymore, and basically said he pretty much didn't care. So they did get a hold of the mom after that. But like I said, I did not find anything. I purposely looked for that. I couldn't find the article that she got that from. So I'm going to take a break, and we will come back and go into the suspects and who we think this is. Hey guys, have you thought about making your own podcast, but you're not really sure where to start? That's how I was at first, and really the only choice that stood out to me was Anchor. And let me tell you why. It was completely free to start, and it has all the tools that allow me to record and edit my podcast right from my phone or computer. And they distribute the podcast for me, so it's heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many other platforms. There's no minimum listenership, and you can start making money from day one. And really everything you need to make your podcast is all in one place. I love it, and I know you will too. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Before we start talking about suspects, I should point out that 60 people actually came forward at some point or another and confessed to this murder.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
What do you think the reason behind that was?
I don't know. I don't know if it was partly because it was so publicized that they wanted fame or their 5 minutes of notoriety. I don't know. But very few were. It didn't seem like very many of them were taken seriously, as far as when they would come and confess. There were thousands of people that were interviewed by the police. So it was a huge, extensive search that they did, and hundreds of people were actually considered suspects.
Wow.
Also, one thing that kept coming up over and over and over as I was researching was the amount of corruption that was happening in LAPD at this time. The FBI never actually had jurisdiction over this case, and they still don't. So LAPD still has all of the case files and everything else for it, and they have never fully released anything. So that's pretty important when you get into what people now believe about who it was.
Yeah.
Because LAPD is not really willing to share a whole lot of what they have in the case files. Okay, so Walter Bailey is number one, and we are not looking at obviously every suspect. I just picked out a few, and just kind of maybe the real person that did it isn't even in this lineup that I have, but who knows? But we're just going to talk about a few.
Got about a 1 in 100th chance.
Yes, right. So, Mr. Walter Bailey, he was a Los Angeles surgeon. Yeah, that's interesting, right? He lived 1 block south of the vacant lot where Betty was discovered. So 2 strikes against Walter right off the bat. 2 of his specialties in his line of services that he provides is mastectomies and hysterectomies.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so 3 for 3, really. And his widow alleged that his mistress knew a terrible secret. So a lot of people think that that terrible secret could have been about this murder, that he was the actual killer, and so they've kind of come up with this theory that that's the guy, and that was the terrible secret that he was holding, or that she was holding. Others believe that maybe the secret that the mistress knew was that this doctor was performing illegal abortions.
Abortions?
Yes. And that seems to come up a couple of times as well. We'll get a little bit further into that. It does seem like this time there was a lot of abortions happening illegally in LA.
Well, with the amount of prostitution and everything going on.
That could have been. And it was right after the same era of the Great Depression and that kind of stuff. So that could have also led to an increase in prostitution in LA, right, just like we talked about in Cleveland. So it is also interesting to note that he did have a neurodegenerative condition that is known to produce violent behavior in some people that are otherwise passive. So all of those things stacked up look like maybe Walter is the guy.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? But I'm never going to say this is the guy right off the bat. We got a whole bunch of options here. So
We got like 100 more.
or 4 or 5. So next option was that it could have been connected to the lipstick murders. Okay, so the lipstick murders, this was completely different. So I don't know. Maybe there are some people that